Hi, Todd Dunn here on September 11, 2019. Today I'm aboard my 1936 wooden powerboat Tortuga, and I want to talk about moorings. In other words, how do those of us who keep boats other than in a marina secure our boats here in Maine? And I'll preface that by saying that the vast majority of boats here in Maine are kept on moorings rather than at a marina. Even here in Southwest Harbor, there are probably about 60 boats at the marina, and there are nearing 200 boats on moorings out in the harbor. And many harbors don't have a marina, and they're just full of moorings. Okay, so I want to start out by describing the different kinds of moorings, and to do that I'm going to use a little bit of work on some drawings just to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about rather than simply describe things. So let's get going. The first part of a mooring is the anchor. This is something heavy that sits on the bottom. There are a number of different kinds of anchors, so let's look at them individually. As I said, there are a number of different types of mooring anchors available. One kind is a mushroom anchor, which consists of a concave steel bowl with a rod attached to the center of it that comes up to a loop for attaching your mooring chain or mooring line to. These steel mushrooms come in a wide variety of weights, anywhere from about 25 pounds up to 1,000 pounds, and they cost between about $40 and about $1,400. They work largely by having the concave steel bowl dig into the mud at the bottom of the harbor, and basically they become set in the mud and are quite difficult to pull up. Because of their steel construction, they have both advantages and disadvantages. When you put something in water, it achieves a certain amount of buoyancy equal to the weight of the volume of water that it displaces. The higher the density, the material that the anchor is made out of, the lower the proportion of the total weight of the anchor that is offset by this buoyancy effect. So a steel has a density about 8 times that of water, so it effectively only loses about 12% of its weight when you put it in water. So a steel anchor is very effective because of its high density. You don't need as heavy an anchor as you do with a lower density material. The negative of it is that it's steel. What happens when you throw a lump of steel in salt water? Well, it rusts. So mushroom anchors tend to have a relatively short life, usually associated with this rod or the loop that you attach your mooring line or bottom chain to rusting out, because that usually is sticking out of the bottom, and it will rust out relatively quickly if it's in the water column. So these things, depending on exactly where they're set and whether or not they get completely buried in the bottom mud or not, can have a life anywhere from about 10 to 15 years if they're fully buried in bottom mud, to as little as 3 to 5 years if they're not fully buried. They are, however, the cheapest way you can go to get a mooring for a boat. The next kind of mooring is an inverted steel pyramid mooring. And they basically look kind of like this, with a solid steel pyramid, usually with a truncated end, and a very thick post to a thick diameter eye that you attach your mooring line or bottom chain to. And you toss these over and they get buried in the mud. This rod that goes up to where the mooring line or chain attachment point is usually much larger in diameter than a rod on a mushroom anchor, and also shorter, so it's more likely to be buried in the bottom mud. One of these things, because it's made of steel, doesn't have to be as heavy as an anchor made of lighter material. and consequently they are not that expensive for the smaller ones. They come in weights ranging from about 35 pounds to about 2,000 pounds, and the cost ranges from around $100 at the low end to as much as $5,000 for one of the big ones. But if they're buried completely in the mud, they'll last a long time, perhaps as long as 30 years. And you can get away with, say, a 2,000 pound anchor for a very big boat. The next kind of anchor is a concrete anchor. Now you can buy these commercially, and when you buy one commercially, usually what they consist of is a concrete block with a steel rod passing through it that you can attach your mooring line or bottom chain to. Now the concrete is much less dense than a steel anchor. Typical concrete has a density about 2.5 times that of water, so it's going to lose about 40% of its weight due to buoyancy. And the result is that concrete anchors need to be much heavier than steel anchors. And they typically run in the 4,000 to 12,000 pound range. And if you buy them commercially, they cost somewhere between about $1,000 and $2,500, plus any shipping that you might incur to get a 12,000 pound block of concrete to your location. The negative of these, other than the cost, is that they're quite big, particularly the heavier ones, and they're only as good as this steel rod that you attach your bottom chain or mooring line to, and that rod will rust out. And on most of the commercial ones, it's replaceable though, and you can pull your mooring up periodically and have a new steel rod put in. Now you can also make your own concrete mooring anchor. It's usually not going to be as heavy as a commercial one. You're probably not going to cast several thousand pounds of concrete in your backyard and then transport it over to the harbor. But a lot of people will, cast a 400 or 500 pound concrete anchor, and what they'll do is just throw a hunk of stout chain into it with one end coming out of the concrete as an attachment point. Now, once that chain rusts through, the anchor is no good. You have to make a new one. And that's, however, only good for smaller boats, because you realistically, for the home concrete anchor builder, are not going to be able to cast a big enough anchor for a big boat. Finally, there's the stone anchor, which is by far the most common around here. The reason for that is simple. Mount Desert Island is made out of granite, and there are a bunch of old granite quarries on the island. So stone blocks are pretty easy to get a hold of, and they're relatively cheap. Now, stone blocks are just natural stone that has a couple of holes drilled through the stone, and then a piece of heavy steel rod, which is called a staple, is bent into a U shape, and the ends are passed through the holes in the stone. They're heated up and bent over with a sledgehammer to hold the staple into the stone. And the mooring line or bottom chain is attached to the staple in some way. In most cases around here, the bottom chain is put on at the same time that the staple is, and the staple just passes through one of the loops of the bottom chain. So you don't even have to have a shackle at the bottom. Now, stone blocks typically weigh somewhere in the 4,000 to 10,000 pound range, depending on the size of the boat that they're meant to hold. A 30-foot boat would certainly get away with a 4,000 pounder, maybe even a little bit lighter block. Depends a bit on the bottom. If there's a good mud bottom, you can use a lighter block. If it's a hard bottom, you need a heavier block. Now, granite weighs about 2 3/4 times as much as water, So you're still going to lose a substantial amount of weight due to buoyancy, but it won't be as bad as concrete, which is lighter per volume than granite. Now, natural stones are relatively cheap. If you live here, you may find that you've got some suitable stones on your property, and you can maybe even get the mooring service people to drill the holes and install a staple for you for very cheap, and you can get away with a couple $100 for a decent sized stone. But if you buy one, they're going to cost somewhere between around $500 and $2,500. Okay, let's move on now and look at the rest of the components of a typical mooring. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about stone block moorings because they are by far the most common moorings here on the coast of Maine. Okay, here's the setup for a typical stone anchor or granite anchor mooring. Down here at the bottom, we have the granite anchor with a steel staple through it. That steel staple will either pass through a link of heavy bottom chain, which is typically 1 to 1 1/4 inch chain. The anchor here is usually anywhere from about 2 to 4 tons of granite. The length of the bottom chain is typically equal to the depth of the water at low tide. So if you're in a spot with a 15-foot depth at low tide, you'll have about 15 feet of heavy bottom chain. Again, that's usually 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch chain. Up on top of that chain, you've got a big shackle and then a smaller shackle, because the big shackle won't be able to pass through the end link of the smaller top chain. The top chain is typically 1/2 inch chain to 5/8 inch chain. I should say bottom chain is usually just natural chain. It's not galvanized, and I'll tell you why in a second. The top chain is usually hot dip galvanized, as I'll explain in a second. Now at the top of the top chain is another shackle that's attached to the mooring ball. And the purpose of the mooring ball is to support the weight of the top chain as it comes up through the water. 1/2 inch chain weighs a couple pounds per foot. So if you have a 30-foot long top chain coming up through 30 feet of water, you're going to need a mooring ball that can support at least 60 to 100 pounds to keep that chain suspended. And attached a couple of links below the top of the chain is another shackle which connects the mooring pendant. Mooring pendant is typically anywhere from 1/2 inch to 1 1/4 inch nylon or nylon polyester combination rope with an eye at the end, and that's what you actually attach the boat to. So that's a typical mooring. I should say, I'll go over the sizes again. For a typical mooring here in Southwest Harbor, Maine, the granite block is going to be between 2 and 4 and maybe even 5 tons, depending on how big a boat it's intended for. Obviously, the bigger the boat, the heavier the anchor will be. The staple is usually 1 inch steel bar, but if it's a big block, say a 4-ton block, it might be 1.5 or even 2 inch steel bar. Bottom chain is typically 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch ungalvanized chain, and the length of that chain is equal to the depth of the water, usually at low tide, and it might be a foot or two longer than the depth at low tide. And then a couple of shackles. One, a big shackle, because you need a big shackle to attach to 1 inch chain or 1 1/4 inch chain. And then a smaller shackle so the pin on the shackle will fit through the top chain, which is usually 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch chain. And its length is typically 1.5 times the depth of the water at high tide. Here, our tidal range is anywhere from 10 to 15 feet. So if you're at 15-foot depth at low tide, you might be as much as 30 feet deep at high tide and would need then a 45-foot top chain. and then the mooring ball, and then a 15 to 20 foot pendant, anywhere from a ½ inch to 1 1/4 inches in diameter. The bigger the boat, obviously the bigger the pendant, both in diameter and in length, because it's further up to the bow from the water. For example, on my sailboat, I use a 20 foot 7/8 inch nylon pendant. The reason I use 7/8 is that's the biggest size that will fit through my chocks with anti-chafing on it. And it's 20 feet long because my boat is 6 feet high at the bow, and I want a fairly long pendant for that. Attached to the loop at the end of the mooring pendant is some sort of pickup setup. It can be as simple as a piece of light line that goes to a lobster float, just something that floats that you can snag with a boat hook and pull up out of the water, or a pickup buoy, which is a long fiberglass rod with a float in the middle and a weight at the bottom end down here that floats upright so that you can simply grab the pickup buoy's wand and pull everything up. On my boat, I have an 8 foot long pickup buoy. About 2 feet of it stays underwater, so the top of it is 6 feet above the water. And I have a piece of 3/8 inch nylon line going down to it, so that once I get the pickup buoy in my hand, pull it up and get a hold of that line, unless it's really blowing, I can, if I have to, even tie the boat off with that temporarily until I'm able to pull the much heavier mooring pendant up onto the boat and get it over the bow cleat. So that's the basics of a mooring here on the coast of Maine. Now let's talk a little bit about how we deal with winter. One aspect of a mooring of this type is that the metal components have a finite life in salt water. They're going to rust. And there is a mitigating factor though, and that is that the bottom mud in our harbors around here is anoxic. In other words, there's essentially no oxygen in it. It's consumed by bacteria. And so if you have metal components buried in the mud, they will last a long time. And you won't have to replace them maybe for as long as 15 or 20 years. However, something that's up in the water column between the bottom and the surface of the water is in an oxic environment, and it will rust. So, for example, the lighter top chain and all the shackles attached to it are going to rust and will have to be replaced much more frequently. On a typical mooring, except in big storms, the anchor, the shackle, and the bottom chain are buried in the mud at the bottom of the harbor. And they are basically just down there. They're not going to go anywhere under normal conditions, and they're going to stay buried in the mud, and they'll last a long time. For example, my mooring has 1 inch bottom chain, and it had a 1 1/4 inch staple. I acquired the mooring 13 years ago. The staple and bottom chain had been replaced about 3 years before that, and last year when I had my mooring fully inspected, in other words, they lifted the whole thing off the bottom and looked at it, my staple was intact at 1 inch. My bottom chain was in good shape, still basically uncorroded, and that's after approximately 16 years. So I think I'll probably get another 15 or 16 years out of my staple and bottom chain. Now, what about the lighter top chain? That chain is normally in the water column, and so it's going to rust. And my experience so far, since I got my mooring 13 years ago, is that I have to replace the top chain about every 4 to 5 years, which is good because the cost to replace the top chain is about $500. But you can stretch that out a little bit by doing what is typically done here to moorings in the winter. When the boat is hauled out for the winter, we decommission the mooring. What's done is the mooring barge goes out, they pull up my top chain and get it on deck, they disconnect my mooring pennant and my mooring ball, and they tie a line to the mooring chain and put a float, typically just a lobster float, with my name and mooring number on it, onto the mooring chain and toss that back into the water. And the line is long enough that my mooring chain will go all the way down into the mud, so over the course of the winter my mooring chain will not corrode anymore. So my mooring chain is suspended by the mooring ball for about 6 months each year and spends the other 6 months of the year in the mud at the bottom, which basically doubles its life relative to keeping it in the water column all the time. And if I had it suspended all the time, I probably wouldn't get more than 3 years out of a mooring chain before it needed to be replaced. Mooring pendants also need to be replaced periodically. They can last a number of years. If we don't have a big storm, I can get 3 or 4 years out of a mooring pendant. However, we usually have at least one significant storm each season, and that can cause a little bit of stretching and weakening of your mooring pendant, and if you're unfortunate, you can even get some chafe on it, and if that's the case, you probably need to replace it every year. But it depends a lot on the weather and how you have your system set up and how good your anti-chafing is. I would say that for the last 13 years, I've averaged about 2 years on a mooring pendant. They cost around $150 for the size I use, so that's a factor in the cost. But basically, that's how our moorings work. We have a heavy anchor of some sort around here, usually a block of granite that weighs several tons, a heavy bottom chain that sits in the mud most of the time except during really bad storms when the wind load on the boat is enough to pull it up out of the mud. And bearing in mind that my heavy bottom chain, which is 1 inch, weighs something like 24 pounds per foot and is 17 feet long, so that's about 400 pounds of chain that you have to pull up out of the mud. So it takes a fair amount of force to pull that up out of the mud into the water column. So that bottom chain lasts a long time. When it finally comes time to replace it, it's going to probably cost me the better part of $1,000, because I don't have a shackle at the bottom, I just have the staple passing through my chain, so they'll have to cut that staple off and put a new one in along with new chain. So that's, a good deal of labor. Anyway, that's it for moorings. I hope you understand how they work a little better. And if you get a good mooring, it's a good, safe place to leave your boat, even in significant storms. My sailboat, 36 feet and almost 16,000 pounds, has ridden out storms with 65 knot winds and 5 to 6 foot waves at the mooring without any issues. My mooring never moved, and everything was fine. And that's one of the big advantages to a mooring. Another advantage to keeping your boat on a mooring is that it's very easy to come and go from the mooring. You're not right next to somebody or right next to a dock. There's basically nothing to hit. And you can go any direction, whichever is convenient based on the wind. And there's no chafe of your boat and fenders against a dock. So those are all good factors. The negative, of course, is that you have to get to and from the boat, which means that you have to have a dinghy and you have to have a place to keep it at the shore. Now let's look at costs. When you buy a new mooring, depending on the size of the mooring, it's going to cost you somewhere, typically for most boats, somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500. How much it costs depends on how big your boat is, how deep the water the mooring is set in. My mooring is set in 17 feet of water at low tide, and my mooring, when I bought it in 2006, cost $1,400. There's another fee that you're going to have on an annual basis is a permit from the local municipality. That varies a lot depending on what town it is that controls the harbor where you set your mooring, and on whether or not you're local or from away. Now, I have my mooring here in Southwest Harbor, but I don't live in Southwest Harbor. I live in the next town over, 5 miles away. So I'm considered from away, and my mooring fee is $140 a year. If I was from here, it would be about $60 a year. If I set my mooring in Bass Harbor, where I live, it would be about $50 a year, but Bass Harbor is a more difficult harbor for the kind of boating that I prefer to do. Winterizing the mooring, which is basically taking the mooring ball and mooring pendant off, putting a rope with a float on it onto the top of the mooring top chain and dropping it down so the chains are all in the mud. It varies from about $50 to $75. You do that once a year if you want your chain to last. Spring commissioning, which is pulling the mooring chain up, attaching the mooring ball and pendant, is about $50 to $75. Most towns require that you have your mooring inspected periodically. Here in Southwest Harbor, you have to have it done every 3 years. And there are two types of inspection. There's what they call a quick inspection, where they just look at the top chain and the connection between the top chain and the bottom chain. And that costs, depending on how long it takes them, somewhere between $150 and $200. And that's a charge every 3 years here in Southwest Harbor. And full inspection is more involved. They pull the whole mooring up and look at everything. They lift it right out of the water, and that is one of the reasons that the bottom chain has to be the depth of the water at low tide, because they pull the top chain up and it probably isn't strong enough to lift the mooring altogether. So they pull the top chain up until they can get the bottom chain attached to their winch, and then use that to yank the mooring out of the mud. And that, depending on how deep it is and what the local charges by the mooring service company are, it'll run you $250 to $300, but you only have to have that done roughly every 6 to 10 years, depending on where you are. Now, if things fail, then chains rust out, mooring pendants get chafed and damaged, you have to replace them periodically. Replacing a top chain is typically in the $400 to $500 range. However, when you do that, you can usually arrange it so that that coincides with an inspection. So, say after every other inspection, you roll that cost into replacing the chain. And when you have to replace the bottom chain and staple, that's going to cost you somewhere between about $750 and $1,250, largely dependent on how deep the water is, because if you're in 50 feet of water, you're going to need 50 feet of very expensive bottom chain, and if you're in 20 feet of water, you're going to need only 20 feet of expensive bottom chain. So that, fortunately, as I said at the beginning, that doesn't happen very often. You can probably go 25, maybe 30 years between replacements of the staple and bottom chain, if you have a nice mud bottom. If you don't have a mud bottom, it's a different story. The chain is going to be corroding and you have to replace it much more frequently. The mooring pendant, as I said, will need to be replaced periodically, sometimes every year, sometimes every 2 years. You may even get 3 years out of one. If you buy a commercially made pendant, depending on how big it is, you're going to probably pay somewhere between $100 and $150. If you splice your own out of 3-strand nylon, you can probably cut that cost in half. So that works out to an average annual cost for a typical mooring of roughly $500. Now that's an amortized cost because you're not going to spend that every year. I mean, in a typical year, I will spend my permit fee and winterizing and spring commissioning, which comes to about $275. But because I have to periodically replace the top chain, and if I'm unlucky, maybe once in my lifetime, replace the staple and the bottom chain, that's going to drive the average cost per year up to around $500. Now let's compare that to keeping a boat in a marina here in Maine. I keep Tortuga, which is a 32-foot boat, in the marina here in Southwest Harbor. That costs $4,000 a year. So if I was willing to keep Tortuga on a mooring, I could save $3,500 a year. That would go toward a lot of chips and beer. Okay, that's what I have to say today about moorings. I hope that's given you a better feel for what a mooring consists of here on the Maine coast, how much it costs on an annual basis, and how we deal with winter when we're not using the mooring. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't, please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to click that notification bell.